In a sleepy southern town, a young black art student in a wheelchair, a consequence of a childhood crash, faces cruel mockery from three young men at a local diner. While everyone else looks away, a member of the Hells Angels biker gang enters. He intervenes to protect her, only to be falsely accused of threatening them. When the police arrive, a stunning truth is revealed, shocking the entire community. The biker is no ordinary man, and the three youths will have to face the consequences of their actions. Before we get into the story, what time are you listening and where are you from? Leave a comment below and let me know. The diner's door chimed as Aisha Robinson guided her wheelchair inside, her hands gently gripping the worn rubber tires. The intense July sun still radiated from her skin, a lingering heat from the cracked Main Street pavement, but the air inside was refreshingly cool, filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon buns. Forks clinked against ceramic plates, spoons stirred sugar into mugs, and a low murmur of conversation filled the cozy space. To most it would feel welcoming, but to Aisha, it felt like being thrust under a harsh spotlight. She navigated toward a secluded table by the window, a place where she could feel somewhat included without being in the middle of it all. People's heads turned just enough for her to notice, a brief but lingering glance that told her they had already made up their minds about her. It wasn't just the wheelchair, though that was enough for some. It was also the shade of her skin, the way her curls framed her face, her presence a silent reminder of things they preferred to ignore. Her life in the wheelchair had begun at age 7 after a drunk driver ran a red light, colliding with her mother's car. Aisha survived, but her spinal cord was permanently damaged. The doctors called her fortunate to be alive. She often questioned if their definition of luck was the same as hers. The waitress, a middle-aged woman in a pink uniform, approached with a notepad and a polite, detached smile. "Morning," she said in a robotic tone, quickly jotting down Aisha's order without a word about her day. Aisha managed a small smile in return, murmuring thank you, knowing it wouldn't lead to a conversation. She placed her sketchbook on the table, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover. Her online art professors often praised her talent for capturing subtle human expressions. Her dream was to become an illustrator, to tell stories through pictures, to create the kind of beauty she sometimes struggled to find in her own world. But in this diner, the dream felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. From the corner of her eye, she noticed a commotion at a back booth. Three young men, likely in their early 20s, huddled over their plates of half-eaten pancakes. One nudged his friend, nodding in her direction. She felt a familiar warmth rising in her chest, a sense of bracing for an inevitable confrontation. A muffled snicker escaped one of them, followed by a slow, exaggerated squeak, mimicking the faint sound of her wheelchair. Another joined in, dragging his sneaker on the floor to imitate a scraping noise. Their laughter started low, a private joke they intended for her to hear. She recognized the pattern, a test of her reaction, seeing how far they could push. Aisha kept her eyes fixed on the menu, trying to appear oblivious. If she responded, they would only be encouraged. If she remained silent, maybe they would lose interest. The other patrons seemed to withdraw into themselves. A man at the counter stared intently into his coffee. A woman by the door raised her newspaper higher, as if the printed words could shield her from what was happening. The air grew thick with tension, the clink of silverware now sharp against the pockets of silence. Then one of them spoke. "Careful, boys, you might scare the poor thing, she might just roll right out the door." His voice, smooth with sarcasm and a familiar ugliness, reached her table. Another chuckled, adding, "Bet she draws real pretty pictures of all the nice white folks around here." The last word hung in the air, heavy and venomous. Aisha's hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Her jaw ached from clenching her teeth. She told herself she had nothing to be ashamed of, but shame still seeped in, uninvited. Her mind flashed back to countless similar moments, from the playground to adults who thought they were clever. She had been told the world was changing, that people were becoming more enlightened. But in moments like this, with strangers laughing at her existence, it felt like nothing had changed at all. The waitress passed by again, her eyes darting toward the booth and then away. Aisha hoped for a second that she might say something, but the woman instead began wiping a counter that was already clean. The hum of the refrigerator filled the void where a voice should have been. The youths grew more confident. One stood, swaggering toward the register, dragging his left leg in a mocking limp. He grinned at her sideways as his friends snickered. A nearby couple exchanged an uncomfortable look but said nothing. The unspoken rule was clear. Don't get involved. Aisha's eyes were fixed on her sketchbook, but she wasn't seeing the blank page. She saw herself small and silent, in a room full of people pretending not to notice. Her throat tightened, a lump forming. She longed to disappear, to slip out the door unnoticed, but her wheelchair made vanishing impossible. The laughter echoed through the diner again, sharper now, like dry wood snapping. She felt the weight of every stare, some curious, some pitying, some tinged with the same quiet judgment she had felt all morning. No one stood up. No one told them to stop. A familiar thought coiled in her chest. It's always easier for people to look away. And in that moment she felt completely alone once more. The door to Sunny Diner opened with a slow creak, letting in a gust of warm air, followed by the sound of heavy boots on the tile floor. A tall man entered, his presence seeming to shrink the air around him. He wore a black leather Hell's Angels jacket, its patches catching the light from the front window, his broad shoulders filling the frame. A thick gray-streaked beard framed his face, and his jaw was set with an air of unyielding resolve. The rhythm of his deliberate footsteps faded into a sudden quiet. Aisha looked up from her sketchbook just long enough to see him pause, his pale, assessing eyes sweeping the room. His gaze passed over the counter, the booths, the faces that were now half-turned toward him, and then it landed on her. She felt her pulse quicken. He looked at her directly without flinching, but also without being intrusive. He didn't glance at the wheelchair the way others did. He met her gaze head-on, and for the first time that morning she felt truly seen. But his attention quickly shifted toward the back booth and the three young men. Their smirks told him everything he needed to know. He saw the one lounging with lazy arrogance, another drumming his fingers in time with his laughter, and the third still turned toward Aisha, his mouth twisted in satisfaction. The man didn't hesitate. He walked slowly, heavily past the other tables, his eyes briefly meeting Aisha's again before he stopped at her table. He pulled out the chair opposite her, sat down, and for a long moment, simply studied her face as if reading her story. "Little sister," he said in a low, gravelly but gentle voice. "Are they bothering you?" Aisha hesitated, her first instinct to shake her head and say she was fine, to not involve anyone else. But he didn't look away or press her. He leaned in slightly. "I know that look. I've worn it myself. They're not looking at you because they know you. They're looking at you because they've already decided you're less than them. I understand. They do it to me too. Not because I ride, but because they decide I'm an outsider before I even speak." Something in his matter-of-fact tone, devoid of pity, made her throat tighten. She wanted to thank him, to tell him he didn't have to do this. But before she could find the words, he pushed back his chair and stood. His boots struck the floor again, steady and sure, as he turned to face the young men. "All right, boys," he said, his voice easily reaching every corner of the diner. "I'm only going to say this once. In here we show respect. To everyone. You seem to have forgotten that." The smirks on their faces froze for a moment before turning into something nastier. The leader laughed first, a sharp, mocking sound. "What's this? The big bad biker is going to teach us manners." His friend across the table grinned. "Looks like you're a little lost, man. This isn't your clubhouse." The third, who had been mimicking the limp, muttered just loud enough for the others to hear, "Trash like that rolls right in with the rest of the garbage." The tall man's expression didn't change, though a cold, heavy flicker passed through his eyes. The rest of the diner had gone completely silent. Conversations had stopped mid-sentence. Even the waitress had stopped wiping the same mug for the third time. Everyone was watching, most from the corners of their eyes, as if afraid to be caught staring. "Be careful," the man said evenly, "because the words you throw around tell me more about you than you want me to know." The leader leaned forward, feigning amusement. "Are you threatening me, old man?" The biker didn't flinch. "Not yet," he said. "But I'm telling you to stop right now." A flicker of uncertainty crossed the young man's face, but pride quickly pushed it away. He pulled out his phone and began tapping at the screen. "You know what? Let's get someone down here who can deal with this. I'm calling the cops. Let's see how tough you are when they show up." His friends chuckled, emboldened by his action. Aisha sat frozen, her fingers clutching her sketchbook so tightly she feared it might tear. She felt her pulse pounding in her neck, the air in the diner thick with an electricity that prickled her skin. She had seen men like the ones in the booth before, men who believed the world would always bend to their will. But she had never seen anyone stand so firmly between that kind of cruelty and its target without a hint of fear. The tall man didn't even glance at the phone. He stood there, shoulders relaxed but solid, his eyes moving slowly from one young man to the next as if sizing them up. There was no shouting, no swearing, no theatrics, just a stillness that made the space around him feel smaller and more contained. It was the stillness of a man who had faced worse situations and emerged on his own terms. At the counter, a man in a ball cap shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the booth and the biker. Two women in the corner booth had stopped talking, their coffee growing cold. Even the cook had leaned out of the pass window, his spatula frozen in midair. The man in leather took a single step back, not in retreat but to give the young men space to make a choice. "This is your chance to fix it," he said simply. "Take it." The leader smirked again, more for show, and held the phone to his ear. "Yeah," he said into it. "We've got some Hells Angels guy in here threatening people. You better get someone down here before he hurts somebody." Aisha's stomach clenched. She felt the eyes of the diner patrons bouncing between the man in leather and the phone. The stranger didn't move or try to stop him. He just stood there, one hand resting lightly on the back of Aisha's chair, his presence a stabilizing force. The call ended and the young man leaned back, satisfied, his friends whispering with tight little grins. The biker's boots shifted as he returned to his seat across from Aisha, his expression unchanged. "They called the law," he said simply as if commenting on the weather. He met her gaze, his voice lowering again. "Don't worry, little sister. I've been through worse." Minutes stretched on. Outside, the faint wail of a siren began to grow louder. Inside, no one spoke above a murmur. The tension had a palpable weight, settling over the room like a heavy cloth. Everyone in the diner was aware that this moment was not over, that whatever came next would decide more than just who finished their breakfast in peace. They waited, their eyes drifting toward the front door, listening to the approaching siren and the faint crunch of tires on gravel as a patrol car drew near. The siren's wail intensified until it seemed to vibrate the windows of the sunny diner. Outside, pulsing blue and red lights reflected off parked cars and the wide glass front. Two black and white patrol cars pulled to the curb, their tires crunching. The sirens ceased in unison, replaced by the hum of idling engines. Aisha felt her stomach tighten, her fingers curling at the edge of her sketchbook. Across from her, Malcolm Hayes sat with his hands resting calmly on the table, his eyes fixed on the door, a man watching the next card in a game he already knew how to play. The door opened, letting in a wave of hot air and the sound of boots on the diner's worn linoleum. Two uniformed officers entered, their quick, practiced gazes sweeping the room, causing people to straighten in their seats. Right behind them came another pair. The leader of the trio at the back booth grinned, his voice dripping with satisfaction as he pointed at Malcolm. "That's him," he said loudly. "He's been threatening us, making a scene. I want him arrested." His friends nodded, wearing the same smug expression of boys who knew they could get away with anything. The nearest officer began moving toward Malcolm, but before he took more than 2 steps, a voice from the back called out in surprise. "Dr. Hayes." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Aisha turned to see the source. A tall, broad-shouldered sergeant stepping in from the doorway, his sunglasses sliding down his nose as he stared at Malcolm as if seeing a ghost. Malcolm's mouth curved into a faint smile of recognition. "Morning, Dan," he said evenly. For a beat nothing happened. The younger officers exchanged confused glances. The sergeant removed his sunglasses completely, still studying Malcolm to be sure. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his tone shifting from surprise to warmth. "Didn't expect to see you back in town." Document. The younger officer who had been approaching Malcolm came to a halt, looking to his superior for direction. The leader of the 3 young men blinked, his smirk faltering. "Doc?" he echoed, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. The sergeant glanced at him briefly before looking back at Malcolm. "This man," he said to the room at large, "is Dr. Malcolm Hayes, one of the best cardiothoracic surgeons in the state. Saved my cousin's life 2 years ago. And if any of you in the department have had your annual physical, you've probably had him check your heart." A ripple of murmurs and quiet exclamations moved through the diner. Aisha saw the couple by the window exchange a wide-eyed look, the man whispering something to his wife. Even the cook leaned further out of the pass window, clearly connecting the dots. The sergeant wasn't finished. He also happens to be the older brother of our police chief, he added, and the son of Richard and Eleanor Hayes. You know, the people who've funded the new library, the kids' sports complex, and half the scholarships at the high school. He let the weight of that sink in. The chatter in the diner swelled into a hum of disbelief. The young men in the back booth no longer looked smug. Their leader's mouth tightened, his eyes darting toward the officers as if to see if his earlier story could still hold. His friends stared at the table, their bodies shrinking in on themselves. The sergeant stepped into the center of the room, his gaze moving between the two sides. "Why don't we all take a breath?" he said, his voice even but carrying an authority that settled over the place like a heavy blanket. He turned to the younger officer nearest him. "Let's separate them, get statements, and check the security footage before we decide who's in the wrong here." One of the officers nodded and moved toward the counter where the manager was standing half hidden. The manager looked nervous, but the moment security footage was mentioned, he scurried toward the office without protest. Malcolm leaned back slightly, his hands loosely folded. His eyes met Aisha's for a moment, and though he didn't smile, his look told her he had anticipated this outcome all along. She felt a strange mix of relief and awe, realizing that his calm wasn't bravado. It was the quiet confidence of a man who had weathered much worse. Around the room, customers were no longer pretending not to watch. Conversations buzzed in low tones, some filled with curiosity, others with an embarrassed recognition that they had been quick to judge the man in leather. A woman in a blue dress whispered to her companion, "That's the Hayes family doctor. I thought he was just some biker passing through." Her companion shook his head slowly, as if reevaluating more than just Malcolm's appearance. The officers moved the three young men to stand by the far wall. Their earlier swagger was gone, replaced by tight shoulders and downcast eyes. The leader kept glancing toward the door, hoping for an escape, but the patrol cars outside made it clear there was none. The sergeant spoke briefly and respectfully with Malcolm before turning to oversee the retrieval of the video. Aisha sat quietly, the lingering adrenaline now mixed with a cautious hope. The atmosphere in the room had shifted, and she could feel it in the way people's eyes moved, no longer with quiet judgment, but with something closer to shame or self-reflection. She wondered if they would remember that it had taken a title, a family name, and a list of donations to see Malcolm differently. The low hum of conversation broke again when the manager returned from his office, a small flash drive clutched in his hand. One of the officers took it and stepped outside to load it into the laptop in the patrol car. The rest of the room waited, suspended in the peculiar silence that precedes a truth being laid bare. Malcolm didn't move or offer any further explanation. He simply rested his forearms on the table, his eyes steady on the door. Across the diner, the young men shifted their weight from foot to foot, their confidence evaporating under the collective gaze of the room. When the officer returned and handed the flash drive to the sergeant, the big man nodded once and turned toward the counter where a small wall-mounted television usually played the news. The manager switched the input and the black screen flickered to life, showing the grainy security footage. The air in Sunny Diner grew even heavier, every eye fixed on the screen, waiting for proof of what had truly happened. The grainy footage started playing on the small wall-mounted television, the timestamp in the corner showing just a few minutes prior. The wide-angle camera captured the row of booths, Aisha's table, and the narrow aisle. At first, the playback's low hiss was almost drowned out by the small noises of the diner, but within seconds the room fell silent. All eyes were on the screen. The evidence was clearer than any testimony. The three young men were seen huddling together in the back booth, their heads tilted toward Aisha. One gestured with his arms as if turning invisible wheels, his lips forming words that no one in the room needed to hear to understand. Another theatrically dragged his leg along the aisle, his face twisted into a cruel parody of sympathy. The third tapped his fingers on the table in rhythm to their laughter, his gaze locked on Aisha as if she were nothing more than a prop. Aisha watched herself on the screen, her shoulders hunched inward, her eyes fixed on the menu, her hands gripping its edges as if it were the only solid thing left. Seeing it from this perspective made her chest tighten. There was no mistaking the humiliation in her posture, the way she seemed to shrink into herself. She bit the inside of her cheek, glancing sideways at Malcolm, who sat across from her in real life just as he had in the video. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at her, his eyes steady as if to remind her she wasn't alone in that moment. Then he appeared in the footage, his boots hitting the floor with slow certainty. He stopped at her table, sat down and spoke to her briefly. On the silent video she could see her own hesitant nod, the way her eyes had met his for the first time. In the real diner she vividly remembered that moment, how his voice held no pity but a calm recognition, and how for a split second she had felt grounded. The video showed him rising, turning toward the booth, his posture firm and his gestures measured. No threats, no looming over their table, no raised fist, just his words, his presence. The playback captured the young men's smug expressions and their feigned outrage when one of them pulled out his phone to call the police. It showed how Malcolm remained still, a hand resting on the back of her chair, an anchor in the storm. When the footage ended, the screen went black. A long breath of silence filled the room before the sergeant spoke. "That's all I need to see." His voice had the finality of a gavel. He turned to his officers. "Write them up for public harassment with racial motivation. 6-month ban from this establishment, 50 hours of community service each." His gaze landed on the ringleader. "And I suggest you think long and hard about what that looked like on screen, because that's who you are when you think no one's watching." The 3 young men were escorted toward the door, their earlier swagger replaced by tight shoulders and downcast eyes. The door closed behind them with a sharp thud. The manager stepped out from behind the counter, twisting a rag in his hands. "Miss Robinson," he began, his voice low, "I owe you an apology. I should have stepped in sooner. I'm sorry." He paused, then added, "Breakfast is on the house. Anytime you come in here." Aisha opened her mouth, then closed it, glancing at Malcolm before answering. "Thank you," she said softly. For the first time that morning her voice didn't waver. He turned to him. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "But you did." "Why?" Malcolm leaned back slightly, one arm draped over the back of his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because I've been where you are," he replied, his tone even. "Different reasons, same look in people's eyes. And I know what it means to have someone step up when the room stays silent." She let his words sink in, feeling their weight and truth. "Most people don't," she said finally. "Most people wait for someone else to do it," he said. "But if you're there and you know it's wrong, you are that someone else." Near the counter, a man in a plaid shirt took out his phone and began recording the television replay. By the time the patrol cars drove away, the clip was already being shared online. Comments started appearing before Aisha even left her seat. In the wider world, people would see a leather-clad biker standing in quiet defiance between a young woman in a wheelchair and 3 sneering bullies. Malcolm glanced toward the window where the police cars had been. Then back to her. "Don't let today make you smaller," he said. "Make it make you bigger." Aisha gave a short nod, a faint smile touching her lips. For the first time all morning she felt like she could breathe without bracing herself. As the low murmur of conversation resumed, she realized the story that had begun with her humiliation was ending with her being seen, truly seen, and with someone beside her who understood exactly why that mattered. 2 days later, the air in the town's community center was filled with the low scrape of folding chairs, people shifting in their seats, and the faint hum of old ceiling fans. Aisha sat in the second row, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her sketchbook closed beside her. Since the incident at Sunny Diner, she had heard the words, "I'm sorry," more times than she could count, from strangers on the street, from people who had been there and remained silent, from the manager who now fumbled to greet her. But hearing it was different from feeling it, and now for the first time in a long while she felt it. The eyes that met hers in the days since were no longer filled with pity or dismissal. They held respect and in some cases, an awkward kind of admiration. Malcolm Hayes stood off to the side of the small stage, no longer in his Hells Angels jacket but in a pressed shirt and blazer, his boots still polished, his beard unchanged. When he caught Aisha's eye, he moved over to her, leaning down so only she could hear. His voice was low but clear. "You have always had value," he said. "You didn't need me to give it to you. The only difference now is that more people have finally found the courage to see it." Aisha felt the words sink deep inside her, beneath her pride, and she nodded without speaking. When the mayor introduced him, Malcolm stepped to the podium, the old microphone squealing softly before settling into a clear hum. He rested both hands on the wood, scanning the rows of familiar faces, Shop owners, teachers, officers, families who had lived there for generations. His voice carried easily, steady and unhurried. "A few days ago," he began, "I stood in a diner between a young woman and 3 men who thought they had the right to humiliate her. What you saw on that security footage was the truth. What many of you didn't see is what could have happened if the situation had been different." He paused, letting the silence settle over the room. "That day I was protected not just by the law but by my name, my profession and my family's standing in this community. People know me here. They know what I do, who my parents are, what my family has given to this town. But I have to ask, if I had been just another biker passing through, if Aisha had been someone you didn't recognize, would we have walked out of that diner with the truth on our side? Or would the story have been written differently before we even had a chance to speak?" A faint rustle moved through the crowd, people shifting, a throat being cleared in the back. The sound of people feeling the weight of the question before they could form an answer. Malcolm's gaze swept the room, landing on different faces, never lingering too long but never avoiding anyone. "This question," he continued, "is not mine alone to answer. It belongs to every single one of you. The way you answer it, not just here in this hall, but in your own hearts, will shape the face of this town long after we're gone." He let the silence hang, not as an absence but as a space for the truth to enter. Then he stepped back from the podium, his expression calm but firm. The applause started slowly from the middle of the room, then grew into a steady swell, though it was more thoughtful than celebratory. The next day, clips of his speech began to circulate online. The same video that first showed the diner incident was now joined by footage of Malcolm's words, filmed on phones from different angles and shared with captions ranging from praise to challenge. In living rooms, coffee shops, and break rooms, people replayed the moment he asked that question. On local talk shows, callers debated whether the town had been shown a mirror and if they were brave enough to look into it. Hashtags appeared, comments multiplied, and the conversation spread beyond the county line. As the evening sun began to set, painting the community center windows in shades of gold, the event was over. Aisha wheeled herself toward the double doors, her sketchbook balanced on her lap. As she passed Malcolm, he gave her a small nod, one that spoke of a shared understanding rather than a goodbye. Outside, the air was warm and open. She rolled forward into it, her chin lifted, the hum of conversation from inside fading behind her. The people who passed on the sidewalk made way for her without hesitation, some smiling, some simply meeting her eyes without looking away. For the first time in a long while, she felt no need to disappear into the background. The sun caught her hair as she moved down the street, her posture tall even in the chair. And if the town still had work to do, and she knew it did, at least now the question had been asked aloud for everyone to hear. The screen fades to black and across it appear the words, "True justice should never depend on status or wealth." Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy. Video Deep Research Canvas Image.